Welcome to this special broadcast brought to you by the Ikhlaas Academia Library and Research Center in Cape Town, South Africa. And today we ask the question, is corruption an obstacle to social justice? With us today, I'm Shafiek Morton, by the way. We have two very special guests. We've got David Lewis, Executive Director of Corruption Watch. And Corruption Watch, he founded in 2011, one of the founding directors. And of course, Corruption Watch is an accredited chapter of Transparency International. David Lewis has experience in the trade union movement, economics. He's been a ministerial advisor. He has an honorary doctorate, a chancellor's medal, and has been an extraordinary professor. Our second guest, Professor Patrick Lumumba, is founder of the Lumumba Foundation, this in 1990, a legal practitioner, a member of the Africa Justice Group, fellow of the Kenyan Institute of Management, one of Africa's 100 most influential people. He's an author, a renowned public speaker. He's director of the Kenya School of Law, and he served as a director of Kenya's Anti-Corruption Commission round about 2010. The question we're asking today, a very important one, an evergreen question, corruption. And what we ask is corruption an obstacle to social justice? I'm going to kick off with a question for our Honorable Professor Lumumba, and I'm going to borrow something from the Corruption Watch website. I'm going to give a definition. Corruption is the abuse of public resources or power for personal gain. Professor Lumumba, would you agree with that generic description or definition of corruption as we understand it?
I agree completely with something useful to add. The late Kofi Annan once said of corruption that unlike prostitution, which affects individuals, it affects the whole society. And I can't agree more that if there is a single thing that affects the society in multiple ways, corruption is that thing.
And let me do the Zoom thing to unmute myself. David Lewis, this is a definition that is on the Corruption Page website. Is this the generic description of corruption understood globally? Because it does seem as if people often give their own spins to interpreting and understanding our topic at hand.
Yeah, it is probably the most widely used definition of corruption, but I should say something to qualify it, and that is that oftentimes when we use this definition, people jump up and say, well, what about the private sector? Aren't they involved in corruption as well? And yes, of course they are. But what we are saying in this definition is that we are less concerned when someone corrupts this, let's say, the Sasol supply chain, than we are when someone corrupts a public sector supply chain. So it's about public resources and public trust, but it does not mean at all that the private sector are not deeply engaged in it. In fact, there are no serious acts of corruption, and sometimes even relatively minor acts of corruption. There are very few that do not involve an intersection between the private and the public. If it's a traffic cop and a driver, you have the public and the private. If it's the CEO and a minister, you have the public and the private. And there are some acts of corruption that don't involve both, but mostly it is where the public and the private intersect that corruption occurs, but it's mostly about public resources and public trust.
Right. And I'm now going to take us into Transparency International. I looked at the CPI index, and for those of us watching our CPI, this is not to do with economics. This is the Corruption Performance Index. And I see that the average score in this index is 43% for sub-Saharan. This is 43%, obviously, out of 100. Highest country, Denmark, at 87%. Lowest country, Somalia, at 9%. But sub-Sahara's average is 32% in terms of this index. Professor Lumumba, what is your reading, what is your understanding of this? Is this a serious cause for concern in sub-Saharan Africa?
It is an indictment of sub-Saharan Africa, and I want to say that even the score is on the higher scale. It's flattering. If you look at the situation on the ground in many sub-Saharan African countries, corruption is endemic. Corruption is an epidemic. And the reason is simple. Many individuals in sub-Saharan Africa go into public office for the purpose of privatizing public wealth. And it is unfortunate that in quite a number of countries now, it is even expected that they should be thieves. A friend of mine said that what happens in the public sector in sub-Saharan Africa is theft on an industrial scale, which we camouflage by describing as corruption. So I can't agree more. And you can see its impact in every sector of the economy. At one time, I said that until the day that you introduce hygiene in the political arena, then everything else will always be on the southern trend.
Indeed, that's an interesting statement, hygiene in the political arena. David Lewis, in South Africa, we're currently going through a situation where it appears superficially as if state is trying to do something about corruption. Just to sort of contextualize what's happening in South Africa, we'll do Kenya just now. Are you encouraged by the fact that just yesterday, Ace Magashule, ANC Secretary General, at least has a warrant of arrest on his name for public corruption? How do we read this? Are we moving into better territory, or was this window dressing so everything can carry on under the table?
I don't think it's window dressing. I think that since Zuma was removed, and corruption was a major factor in the opposition to Zuma and the removal of Zuma, I think we have in place a reformist government, but we also have in play a governing party in which the standoff between two powerful factions, one very much a Zuma faction of whom the active leader most believe was Ace Magashule, and the reformist government or the reformist faction of the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, which is not to say that Cyril Ramaphosa's faction is as clean as riven snow, but the fact is that I think much has been achieved since Ramaphosa came into power. That is to say that much has been achieved by his government in its capacity as the governor of the state. Little has been achieved with respect to the ANC, and this is an enormous constraint on the Ramaphosa government acting as a government unconstrained by forces that are not supportive of their anti-corruption campaign. So new institutions have been created, and most importantly, in the recent past, several arrests have been made in serious corruption cases of businessmen, police generals. It's not often that you get 7 police generals arrested in a single day. Police generals, private sector people, and then of course yesterday the warrant issued for one of the most powerful politicians in the land, and that is the Secretary General of the ANC and a leading member, if not the leading member, of the faction that opposes the reform. So I think it would be, I think, very churlish to describe this as window dressing. Is it enough? Well, it's never enough. And it certainly won't be enough until the situation in the ANC is resolved. As long as there is this enormous constraint from this incredibly powerful political body on the government, on its government, actually, we are not going to see the situation with respect to corruption resolved satisfactorily in South Africa. And I'm afraid that's going to involve a titanic battle, which is going on at present. But I think, yesterday's arrest was a powerful indication that that not even his position as Secretary General will protect him from that. Of course, Magashule and his opponents are going to say that, and his supporters are going to say that he has been arrested, or a warrant has been issued for his arrest, and that it's a political move to resolve the factional battles. Well, they would say that, but I think his involvement in not only this particular case of corruption, but several other cases of very serious corruption, like the Stina Dairy case, which I think many listeners will be familiar with, is legend. So, really, they could have picked many cases of corruption to arrest Magashule for. And they have chosen this one because I think it's probably the best case that they have.
Professor Lumumba, I'm sure there are some resonances in all of this for you. Obviously, we're discussing is corruption an obstacle to social justice. One of the main facets of what we saw during the last 9 years is what the Zuma rule is being described at, is the compromisation of the judiciary. Have you seen a similar scenario in Kenya, where as corruption becomes more epidemic or more pandemic, the judiciary becomes more and more compromised?
Let me say that I can contextualize this to the period when I served as the director of the Anti-Corruption Commission at that time. And one of the complaints that we had then was that there was no political will. And that if in the absence of political will, the signal that was being sent to critical arms of government, including the judiciary, is that you only slap the corrupt in the wrist. But I can say now that while corruption remains endemic in Kenya, there is political will. There is an understanding by this administration that if you don't deal with corruption, you can't handle agriculture, you can't handle unemployment, you can't handle education. And I think the judiciary has taken the cue. And I've seen in the recent past certain convictions which would not have taken place a few years ago. Individuals in government. I've seen cabinet ministers being forced out of office and their cases being taken to the judiciary. But one of the things that must be appreciated, and this is where sometimes we accuse the judiciary, in my view, falsely, is the desire on the part of the public and of the observers that conviction should come swiftly. It doesn't work that way because white-collar crime and corruption are very sophisticated. These individuals sometimes engage very good minds at the time of the inception of the corrupt activities with a view to defeating the law. So it takes a little longer, is a lot more complex, but my verdict is I can see the judiciary getting the cue from the political willingness of the people in power and doing the right thing. Inescapably, of course, there'll always be a few individuals in the judiciary who are susceptible to manipulation, but institutionally, I think the judiciary is responding positively.
David Lewis, obviously, do you think that what South Africans need to understand and what dissatisfied people in sub-Saharan Africa need to understand is the fact that social justice or civil justice, whatever we'd like to call it, as Professor Lumumba has pointed out, that the wheels they don't even turn slowly, they grind slowly.
Yeah, we've not really had a problem with the judiciary, although there are some signs that honeymoon might be ending, which is very, very disturbing, because the judiciary has been one of the real bows in one of the real arrows in the quiver of those opposed to corruption and those fighting corruption, particularly at the higher levels, particularly at the level of the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal. I was very disturbed yesterday to see that in the charges leveled at Magashule, one charge is of paying a sum of money to an acting judge. It doesn't say what she is alleged to have done in return, but it's really one of the first occasions on which a judge is alleged to have been involved in an act of what may look like what may well be bribery. So our judiciary is okay. Our prosecuting authority has been terrible. Our prosecuting authority and our law enforcement authorities, our policing authorities, are amongst the most corrupted institutions in the land. And of course, this affects how the courts perform. When they get lousy prosecutions brought to them, or inadequate investigations brought to them, or not brought to them at all, what can they do? What can they do about it? But even that having been said, the wheels of justice do indeed grind very slowly. There's a legal, not more than a tradition, a legal norm, a legal requirement that somebody is brought before a judge on criminal charges, that that the prosecution should be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, because the law is strongly averse to imprisoning innocent people. It would rather let a guilty person go free than an innocent person land in prison. And so there are all sorts of procedural protections which frustrate the public enormously. There are all sorts of protections that can, and with a good lawyer, as one good lawyer once told me, you can spin out a case for forever. So, like with the Magashule case yesterday, I would vouch that if this, when I hope this case for which he has been charged, and 7 or 8 others have already been charged, goes to trial, by the time the Constitutional Court hears the last appeal in this case, because these are people with the money to spend on the best lawyers, by the time the Constitutional Court hears this case, it will take 5 or 6 years probably to conclude this case. And that's why what is very important in, say, the Magashule case is what the ANC now does. Do they keep him on as General Secretary on the basis that he's innocent until proven guilty, which is what the ANC always claim? Do they keep him on as General Secretary for the next 6 years, earning a salary and possessing enormous political power, or do they suspend him now? Because this case is not going to take weeks to resolve. It's going to take years to resolve, and that does impact upon justice and the requirement that justice be seen to be delivered. Certainly, people will have experienced the same frustrations as they've done in the Zuma case, which has been going on now for 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, I'm not sure how long. And we're nowhere near the conclusion. We're still in the first court, and it hasn't even started there yet. So criminal cases are difficult, but there is some good reason for why the protections for people accused of criminality are so elaborate and so comprehensive. And that is because of the principle that rather one guilty man or guilty person should go free than one innocent person should be jailed.
Professor Lumumba, to try and further unpack this whole thing, somebody once told me, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, that it's not the jail terms that make these people, that stop these people, or are the punishment. Somebody actually said it's the shame and it's the exposure and it's the inconveniences that come with it that acts as more of an effective punishment than an actual jail sentence. Am I talking sense here?
You are talking some sense, but there is a sense in which the total package must be seen as useful. I've always taken the view that those who engage in corruption really have gone beyond shame.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are so shameless. Some of them have seared conscience, so that when you talk about conscience, you talk about shame, they are not bothered, because when corruption is the name of the game in town, it is those who don't participate in it that look bad. And then there is a sense in which they don't mind going to jail. Some of them can appear to be in jail, but they are not in jail. And even when they're in jail, they continue to run their businesses as if nothing happened. And I've always also taken the view that you must hit these individuals where it matters most. Seize their ill-gotten wealth, take away their civil liberties, bar them from holding public office, take away their right to vote for a period, and make it subject to review. And I think that in countries where corruption is endemic, we should also introduce something that is called a hall of shame, where their images are displayed for posterity to see. And those are the combination of things that I think will really put sense into them and also serve as a lesson for those who may want to participate in corruption.
Indeed, David Lewis, let's get back to I think, the biggest question. And the question, the United States could even fall into this category right now. Is corruption more pervasive in places where money can flow into elections? Because in those cases, governments are only going to listen to the rich or those who give them the money.
Yeah, the quick answer is yes. We have a real problem with party political funding. Most countries have an issue with party political funding, and attempts to regulate it and limit it have been, remarkably unsuccessful. So we have a Party Political Funding Act that was passed after much cogitation and controversy, well over a year ago now. And I was surprised when the act was passed. Suddenly the ANC, after long opposition to regulating party political funding, suddenly discovered somewhere that they supported it, because all the other political parties have opposed it. It's one of the few things that South Africa's major political parties are agreed on, is that they don't want their funding regulated. And then the ANC seems to have changed its mind, because although Parliament has passed the act and the President has proclaimed it, he hasn't signed it into effect yet. And that is, after more than 15 or 16 months. So we're actually considering, and are likely to do so, approaching the courts to ask the courts to order Ramaphosa to sign this act into power. Yes, it is a huge problem. In the asbestos case, in which Magashule is one of the accused, you'll see how much money the businessman who is accused donated to the ANC. And it's absolutely common practice. And it has to be regulated. I'm thinking that maybe one of the best ways to regulate it would be to regulate the amount of money that political parties can spend on election campaigns. Although I acknowledge that would probably be very difficult to do. It's said that the ANC spent a billion rand on the last local government elections. Really, do you need to, buy everyone who comes to your rally a meal, provide them with a T-shirt, provide them with a bus? If you're a political party vying for competition, you'd think your supporters would be willing to do some of those things for themselves. And so I don't know how you effectively regulate party political funding, but there are ways at least of limiting the influence of money on electoral politics, certainly.
Professor Lumumba, does Kenya have a similar situation in terms of funding flowing into political parties, particularly before elections?
Yes, indeed, we do have a law that allows government to fund political parties if they meet a certain threshold in terms of membership in parliament. But donation from individuals and institutions is completely unregulated, which you probably in the political arena. There are individuals and institutions which fund these political parties with the expectation that they would benefit from government contracts and other related matters. And the typical Kenyan politician, as indeed in other parts of the world, is very reluctant to have these regulated. And even if it is regulated, they have means and ways of circumventing the law. And you see these, as David has already said, in terms of the kind of money and resources that are deployed during the electioneering period. And you can rest assured that this money is recouped one way or the other. And I think that there is a case, and it lends legitimacy to what I said at the very beginning, that until the day you introduce hygiene into your politics, until the day you sanitize your politics, you are going to affect your economic activities. David did at the beginning mention something about the involvement of the private sector. You must remember, and I'm putting this in a very simplistic way, that if those in the public sector are the demand side, the private sector is normally the supply side. And they will tell you, but what can we do? If you want a contract, then it's factored into the procurement process. In a nutshell, we have a problem with political party funding. The beauty is that it is recognized by players and government. But in order to look good, introduce pieces of legislation which they don't intend to enforce. And that is where the difficulty is. There is something to copy from the Scandinavian countries, where I think they do a little better than most in terms of how they conduct their politics.
Indeed. And in the context of the topic of our discussion, which is brought to you by the Ikhlaas Academia Library and Resource Center in Cape Town, our special guests are Professor Patrick Lumumba from Kenya and David Lewis from Corruption Watch in South Africa in Gauteng. David Lewis, over to you now. Foreign companies, we so often hear about foreign companies coming in and corrupting things. In South Africa, we had the saga of the arms deal very early on, people coming in and bribes being paid. That's where the whole Zuma thing originated from, it seems, is from a foreign company offering bribes. So how do we deal with this particular scenario? Do we need to put restrictions on foreign companies? How do we monitor this?
No, I don't think we have to put special restrictions on foreign companies investing in South Africa, but you have to, be aware that some of the most high-minded corporate names in the world are just as want to bribe as the sleaziest Bosasa company or Gupta company. I mean, as you said, we did have the arms deal in which British, French, Scandinavian, German, Italian, Spanish companies were the suppliers. And the arms deal are the suppliers of arms everywhere in the world. And the arms trade is legendary for its levels of corruption. But I mean, in recent years, we've seen others, the auditing firms, KPMG, Deloitte, very heavily involved in some of the most corrupt conduct that we've seen. A company like McKinsey, blue chip, gold standard management consulting company, Bain and Company, McKinsey's greatest competitor, SAP, the big German software multinational. So you've just got to see that, it gives the lie to this notion that it's only developing countries that are involved in corruption. I mean, I don't doubt it that many of these companies that I've named would not engage in this level of corruption in their own countries. And that is because A, they have better reason to fear the law enforcement authorities in their own countries. And B, the reputational thing does have more weight in those countries often than it does in our countries. And these are all headed by important people, which is why they often get away with their corruption to the extent that they do. But, down here, as they like to say, that's the way business gets done. And so they excuse themselves on the basis that we couldn't get a contract any other way. Because that's the way they do things in South Africa, but they don't do things that way in Sweden or Britain, and so we won't do it in our own countries. We don't have to do it in our own countries. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't prohibit them from doing business in South Africa. I would just be as vigilant with them as I would be with any other company.
Absolutely. Professor Lumumba, getting back to you, another question. Some people are suggesting that there should be dedicated courts for corruption. Do you think we've got the capacity to do something like this in sub-Saharan Africa, special courts for the corrupt?
In fact, the truth is that in Kenya, we do have such dedicated courts, which are christened anti-corruption courts. It's not that they have any special training, but the judges have been granted this jurisdiction to ensure that the hearing of these cases are expedited. There are those who think that this is a good thing in terms of ensuring that you have people who, by dint of training, when training comes, and who by dint of experience then have the ability to understand the little nuances of corruption cases. Yet there are those who also argue that it introduces who then become influenced, and they think that their duty is to convict at all times. There may be merit in either way, but I think that dedicated cases is important because I see a number of cases in Kenya and in sub-Saharan Africa where magistrates who do not understand the DNA of white-collar crime, the DNA of corruption, look at it as if it was breaking and entering, as if it was burglary, but it is different. So I think that there is a case for dedicated cases, or rather dedicated courts with proper guidelines to ensure that the judicial officers are moved by the facts, the law, and of course the evidence as articulated by prosecuting authorities.
David Lewis, a lot of governments have commissions of inquiry into issues surrounding corruption. In South Africa, we've now seen the Zondo Commission. There's a lot of cynicism about commissions of inquiry. What is your take?
I think there's good reason for being cynical about commissions of inquiry. I mean, it's the time-honored way that governments under pressure use to, kick the proverbial ball into touch. And so you have a commission, the commission gets set up, it takes a long time to get going, it takes an even longer time to complete its duty, and then, you have a couple of sort of mealy-mouthed recommendations that the government is not obliged to to even implement, and often doesn't. On the other hand, commissions of inquiry are entitled to be far more wide-ranging than, say, a court case is. A court case is bound by the four corners of its case. It can't, go off into other areas just because it finds out an interesting tidbit of information in the course of its trial that may point to corruption elsewhere. That's not the case before it. Whereas a commission of inquiry can really go off wherever it sees that as long as it keeps its terms of reference, wherever it sees that its a remit would be better met if it chose to investigate something that came up in the course of its hearings and its deliberations. They cost a hell of a lot of money. I'm not one who is too cynical about the Zondo Commission. I think, but for one instance, one important set of instances, I think Judge Zondo has done his job reasonably well. It has cost an absolute fortune, but there had to be a commission of inquiry after the period of state capture. It almost performs something of the function of a kind of truth commission, getting things out there. I rather wish with the Zondo Commission that more attention was being paid, and Judge Zondo said it will be the case in the report that attention will be paid to working out how this all happened and how it can be prevented in the future, rather than dealing with too much with individual cases of corruption. Those are for the prosecuting authority to deal with. And I think the Commission of Inquiry is to understand what it was about governance in South Africa, what it is about South Africans as a people that allowed this to happen for so long and in such a public way, and what it is that we need to do to prevent it from happening in the future. But yes, so we have a long history of commissions of inquiry that have gone nowhere. We have a history of commissions of inquiry that have been, I think, corrupted. I don't know if you remember, but we took the Sariti Commission, which investigated the arms deal, to court, and because we believe that the commission did not properly conduct that inquiry, did not do as it was charged, the High Court, supported ultimately by the Supreme Court of Appeal, overturned its findings after many years of deliberation and many hundreds of millions of rands spent. The court nullified its findings because it found, with our argument, that it had not conducted a proper investigation. And it laid down what constituted a proper investigation. It's the first time ever that a commission of inquiry has been found to be subject to judicial review. And it was a very interesting and very important case for the world, actually.
No, it certainly was. Professor Lumumba, to go over to you, the legal eagle, as it were, do you think that corruption should have harsher sentences and harsher punishments? And the context given to this is the fact that corruption, as we know well, has a domino effect. And of course, it goes as deep as affecting issues of social justice. Do you buy into the idea that corruption should even perhaps have its own legal applications in terms of harsher sentences and punishments?
I have no doubt in my mind. I think at one time when I was very frustrated, I even suggested that corruption should be declared a crime against humanity. Perhaps that is going overboard, but that did underline my views on what I think about corruption. Just think about corruption, for example, in Kenya and in many African countries now. During this COVID period, you have individuals within the ministries of health engaging in corruption, and people are dying as a result of it. you go to the road sector, to the education sector. These are individuals that ought to be treated in the same way that you are dealing with people who commit murder, particularly when we are talking about serious fraud. And I'm quite clear, therefore, that the jail sentences ought to be harsher. I'm quite clear that they should have their civil liberties curtailed. I'm quite clear that even when we talk about presumptions of innocence, there are certain instances where an individual appears to be living beyond their known means, then the presumption of innocence should be tweaked a little. I have no doubt in my mind that when you hit these individuals where it matters most, seize their wealth, as I said a little earlier, take away their civil liberties, have them exposed in a hall of shame, take them out of society, it will also serve as some kind of education of those who may want to engage in corruption. That is my view about this heinous crime.
Professor, I'm going to bounce off you again in terms of your idea of asset forfeiture. In South Africa, there's an asset forfeiture unit. Do you think that this is an absolutely vital cog in the fight against corruption? Because if you take away the toys from the boys, they can't play anymore.
I can't agree more, but they are different. I don't know what the South African situation is, that asset seizure is pegged upon criminal conviction. And I am of the view that that should not be the case, because as Lewis alluded to it a little earlier, sometimes you know an individual has engaged in corrupt activities, but you do not have the kind of evidence that would sustain conviction, which requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. So you have unexplained wealth. Give an example. Somebody who is earning 9,000 rands a month, and yet he has his children in the United States paying in Ivy League schools, he is building in Santon, he has an apartment in Dubai and one in the Cayman Islands, and yet you cannot convict those individuals. The question then is, should we peg seizure on criminal conviction? And I know through Transparency International, David can speak with greater authority on this, but I have no doubt in my mind that asset seizure is something that is very important, because that is what pains them most. Perhaps the jail sentence does not even do that. It is the seizure of the assets.
David Lewis, would you agree with Professor Lumumba that at the core of a lot of the things we're discussing, the seizure of assets and the taking away of the ill-gotten wealth is probably even a more effective punishment in a sense than a jail sentence?
Well, I think yes, but I think jail sentences are absolutely critical features of the whole armory of the state. But I think that asset forfeiture is absolutely critical. In South Africa, it doesn't await a criminal conviction. It doesn't have to be preceded by a criminal conviction. I'm not exactly sure what the standard is, how the standard works. And there may be a distinction between the freezing of assets and the actual seizure of assets. It may be that the final handover or the final possession of the assets by the state requires criminal conviction, but the freezing of the assets, and that can happen for years at a time, doesn't require a criminal conviction. And it's an incredibly important instrument. Prof. Lumumba says that he sometimes in his frustration has thought that corruption should be considered a crime against humanity. And in fact, this is not a dead issue by any stretch of the imagination. It's still very much, there at the front of the debate. I have to say in my frustration, and I have to admit that as a human rights activist, I've sometimes thought execution wouldn't be a bad way of dealing with corruption, which is not something that I would publicly adhere to. But I'll give you an example of why it's not such a bizarre thought. I mean, take what's happened here recently around the corruption of the procurement of equipment for dealing with the coronavirus. You know, this is personal protection equipment for nurses and doctors and for patients themselves. It's life and death. There's no doubt about it. And here we are in something that everybody refers to as a war. We're in a war against the pandemic. Well, do you remember what used to happen in wartime? When people, even in the Second World War, when people engaged in that level of corruption, my recollection is they used to get shot on the spot. Now, I'm not recommending that, let me tell you. But when you saw the outrage of people at the fact that there are actually people, senior people in government who can do this, I tell you, it would not have been difficult to get the support of the public to shoot them on the spot. But it's not something I advocate, but it accords with public feeling and public outrage about some of these cases of corruption.
No, absolutely. David Lewis, we won't hold you to the firing squads. Don't worry about it. Professor Lumumba, it's often been said that in sub-Saharan Africa we're very poor, and poverty is trotted out as an excuse or a justification or an amelioration of why a person was corrupt. How do we get ourselves around this question of poverty, of people saying, I don't want to be poor again, yet they steal from the people to fulfill this particular dream?
That argument is, in my view, stilts. And the reason is this: it is not true that those who engage in mega corruption are poor. No, the people who actually engage in corruption are the people who have good jobs. They are senior individuals in the public service. Your typical individual who is poor is actually a victim of corruption. The poor market woman who is forced to pay one rand to some public officer in charge of a market does so because she's been made to believe that that is the only way in which you can access services. The poor person who is trying to access a license and who is told, in order to have your matter expedited, you must pay 2 rands or 2 shillings or 1 kwanza, is a victim. So that argument is without merit. But that is not to say that reasonable compensation is a useful thing in terms of creating a level of dignity. And I say this particularly with regard to those who are in the disciplined forces, like the police forces, like in the armed forces and similar forces. People ought to be reasonably compensated, but it cannot be argued that we are corrupt because we are poor. I think we are corrupt essentially because we have made that a way of life, and we are corrupt because the public tolerance for corruption has become the norm, and people think that is the best thing to do and to engage in. So it is not true that because we are poor, we ought to be corrupt.
David Lewis, how do we deal with people who do not respect the processes of justice against corruption? Just this morning, Stephen Grootes was accused by Carl Newhouse of being a single-handed kangaroo court, obviously referring to the media. Then we also have instances, for example, of members of the EFF insulting the Zondo Commission, for example. How do we deal with this particular arena?
Well, you know, I think we deal with it forcefully. I mean, when I said there was only one area in which I think Judge Zondo has seriously failed his commission, what I was referring to there, what I was thinking about there, was his failure to take action against people who have treated his commission with absolute contempt. They include the EFF, but they include very heavily President Zuma, or former President Zuma. You know, Zondo has very powerful instruments at his disposal to deal with people who call him biased, prejudiced, incompetent. I mean, these are all lowering the standing of the commission in the eyes of the public. And I think Zondo has an absolute duty to punish people who do that and to use, as I say, the very powerful instruments at his disposal to punish them, including jail time, I might add. And he really should be doing that. Judges should not accept being treated in this way unless it was really, really deserved. And it's not deserved in Zondo's case. And you know, if it could only be construed to be deserved if a court held that to be the case. So I think they should be treated very forcefully. You know, the media have, you know, and a section of the media have been vital, you know, instruments in confronting corruption in South Africa. Others have participated in corruption, but you know, the media that Carl Niehaus is talking about and is opposed to, and certainly Stephen Grootes this applies to, are not, you know, the ANN7 or the independent group. They are the investigative journalists who have dug up so much of the corruption. You know, the media are protected. They have protection. Again, I think they should be maybe slightly better protected, but they do have protection. They need to realize and understand, as I'm sure they do, how much power they have. And once you have the power to name somebody as corrupt, you have to be extremely careful and thorough in your investigation and circumspect in the way you use that power. But they are a vital instrument, and because they're such a vital instrument, they deserve the extra level of protection that they get and to be defended by freedom of speech considerations. But they have to, you know, all power has to be exercised with a degree of circumspection, and it applies no less to the media than it does to any other institution in the society. But in any argument involving Carl Niehaus, I would support the other side.
All right, Mr. Pepcore. Professor Lumumba, there is an argument in terms of corruption eroding social justice at all levels, is that there is a deficit of social values, and people suggesting we have to return to Ubuntu in the sense that we are who we are through others. I know it's a philosophical as opposed to a legal question, but what is your response to it?
I can't agree with you more. I remember in Kenya when we were making the constitution in the early 2000s, and when we enacted the constitution in the year 2010, we dedicated a whole chapter to values, chapter 6 of our constitution, because we took the view, the collective view, that over the years our values had been eroded, that we had become a people who are likely more inclined to put in public office individuals who engage in corruption in a very blatant way, and that there is no sector of the society that was untouched, that you find this happening in churches, you find this happening to a limited extent in mosques and in temples, you find it in schools, in all sectors, and that we need to go to what in a cliched manner has been described, go back to the basics and begin to do things and to do good because it is good to do good. We found it in institutions of higher learning where there is sex for marks and those very low level kind of conduct. So I think there is a deficit, and you find it when you talk to people. And I recently talked to a young man who wanted to join politics, and he said, I'm joining politics in order to acquire wealth, and I will bribe the electorate so that they give me the opportunity because I know I'll recoup it. And that young man is perhaps representative of very many young men and women across the continent of Africa. If you see how people strive to get into public office in Africa, Sometimes it is a cutthroat situation and throats are actually cut. So we need, as you rightly said, to go back to basics. And there are quite a number of things that we did in our communities, which was a check. I mean, I gave this example at one time in Nigeria, and I said, if you had somebody who wanted to marry your daughter, and this is not gender insensitive, it is realistic. If you had a thief who wanted to marry your daughter and is a multi-billionaire, would you accept? And somebody in my audience said yes. But I asked them, if you had a village goat thief, would you accept the goat thief to marry your daughter? He said, no. And you can see the contradiction. One is a multi-billionaire thief whose activities actually impact the society a lot more gravely. And one is a Mickey Mouse individual engaged in village escapades, and he has the mark of Cain upon his forehead. So you can see this very jaundiced approach to values. But in a nutshell, there is a deficit, and we've got to go back to the basics, assuming that the basics were purged of this kind of things that we are talking about.
David Lewis, I was very interested to read that the United Nations in their 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, that corruption pops up there, and there's a call by the UN for countries, all countries, not just sub-Saharan countries, to reduce their levels of corruption to allow the world to have a sustainable future. Obviously, it's bedrock being social justice. This, I think you'll agree with me, speaks to the very importance of what we're discussing today.
Yeah, no, it does. I think it's Article 16, I think, of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, and for good reason. You know, the sums of money, although nobody can calculate them with any degree of accuracy, and they'll always be underestimated. By the very nature of corruption, they'll be underestimated. But the sums of money are eye-watering. I mean, you know, the illicit financial flows out of Africa exceed by an order of magnitude the value of aid flows into Africa. So, I mean, you know, you're talking about serious sums of money here, and they all come from the public purse. You know, they all mean less efficient power generation. They mean less effective healthcare systems, less effective education systems. They go to the core of sustainable development. And so it's not surprising to me that the UN should have included them, and I think they did quite belatedly, actually, in the Sustainable Development Goals. But you know, as to that last question that you put to Professor Lumumba, you know, I've come in the work that we've done now to realize that we've got to give attention to this question of behavior change. It's very difficult. It's very daunting. How do you change the behavior of a whole nation? It's easy to think of ways of fixing the procurement system, of strengthening the criminal justice system. But if you have a behavioral problem at the core, how do you change that? And I, you know, kind of wish that government would pour millions and millions of rands into trying to affect behavior change. And there are instances in which it has been done successfully. I mean, we have the whole AIDS program as a good reference point there, the condomize program, you know. Believe you me, I was, you know, involved in a union of truck drivers at the time that was started. And it wasn't an easy thing to persuade truck drivers that they should use condoms. But the program continued. It continued on a national scale, and we achieved behavior change there. And we should try and do the same thing with corruption, because I think we all have to acknowledge, as you have, and certainly Professor Lumumba has, that it is about at its final at its end, it is about the behavior of individuals and of communities.
Absolutely. Professor Lumumba, as we wind down for this particular session on corruption being an obstacle to social justice, your concluding remarks in the light of our discussion today.
Corruption has been recognized as a cancer in the body politic. We have seen that the United with this convention domesticated. But my view is that the road meets the rubber when we begin to change people's behavior. Easy enforcement of those laws and punishment of those individuals is one of the ways in which we have fought HIV/AIDS with the kind of vigor that we have fought Ebola, with the kind of vigor that we are fighting this pandemic of gigantic proportions. And all hands must be on deck in this war. Thank you.
Professor Lumumba, thank you for that. Unfortunately, some of your final comments got a bit garbled because of low bandwidth, but everybody did get the gist of it. You have been watching a special broadcast brought to you by the Ikhlaas Academia Library and Resource Center in Cape Town. Our topic is corruption an obstacle to social justice. Our special guest, Professor Patrick Lumumba from Kenya, a founder of the Lumumba Foundation, and so many things on his CV. David Lewis, well known in South Africa, Corruption Watch, who has a link to Transparency International. Gentlemen, thank you very much for gracing us today, and may your struggles against corruption go from strength to strength.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lumumba.
Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Thank you very much. And with that, we conclude the special broadcast from myself, Shafiek Morton, and the Ikhlaas Academia Resource Center and Library in Cape Town.